Today, you and I are stepping into a world where power is measured in blood, starting with a man who could command an entire room without uttering a single word. Kelechi Obiora was simply impossible to overlook. At only 32 years old, his youthful, striking features contrasted sharply with a cold, unsettling calmness that suggested he had survived more than any young man should. His eyes were dark pools of absolute certainty, and his quiet nature alone forced seasoned politicians to watch their words around him. The sheer scale of his family wealth was staggering, spanning lucrative oil fields, vast estates in Lagos, and telecommunications. While public newspapers praised their charity work and hospital donations, the locals knew the truth. The Obiora Empire was built on a foundation of bones.
Beneath the gleaming facades of their Victoria Island high-rises lay a dark underbelly of black market weapons smuggling routes and old family blood. Behind closed doors, secret documents changed hands, and illegal shipments remained buried in unmarked crates, all to preserve the legacy of a dead patriarch whose influence still lingered like a heavy fog. The late Chief Augustine Obiora had established this dynasty through absolute terror, knowing that a single whisper of defiance could cost a man his entire life. But the old tiger was gone now, leaving his son Kelechi to hold the reins. On this particular evening, Kelechi sat at the head of a massive mahogany table inside the family mansion, staring down the ruthless elders who had served his father. The air was thick and heavy with unspoken threats. Leaning back in his leather chair with a smug, knowing grin, Chief Arinze studied the young heir with the eyes of an old predator. His white hair and massive gold ring broadcasted decades of survival, while beside him, Mr. Danladi remained quiet, a financial wizard who laundered money for some of the most dangerous cartels in West Africa. Across from them sat Ojukwu, a scarred enforcer who had long controlled the family smuggling routes. These men had not come to offer guidance. They were here to measure the boy. Leaning forward, Kelechi flattened his palms on the wood. "My father is dead, and the crown belongs to me now," he declared calmly. "From this day forward, our entire operation changes." Chief Arinze let out a dry chuckle that filled the room, though nobody else dared to join in. Arinze mocked the young heir, suggesting the true authority was not some fancy agbada a boy could just throw on to look important. Kelechi remained perfectly still, his expressions completely unreadable. The old chief leaned in closer, his voice dripping with venom as he reminded the room that Chief Augustine had built their wealth with iron and violence, not boardroom smiles. Yet here was this boy claiming he could wash their hands clean overnight. "I mean what I said," Kelechi replied, his voice flat. Mr. Danladi shook his head, pointing out that their shipping ports, oil licenses, and bribes were all linked like a web. You cut one thread, and the whole thing collapses. Kelechi merely stared back. "Watch me." Ojukwu snorted, muttering that the late chief would turn in his grave. A chilling silence gripped the boardroom as Kelechi quietly declared that his father's reign was officially history. The smug grin evaporated from Chief Arinze's wrinkled face, replaced by a dark scowl. He warned the young man that the dead still cast long shadows, reminding him of old promises and blood debts that could not be easily ignored. "You cannot just turn wolves into sheep overnight," the old man sneered. Standing up slowly, Kelechi towered over them, his presence commanding. "That is where you fail to understand," he said, his voice echoing in the quiet. "You assume I must rule through terror just because my father did. But from today, we operate strictly within the law. If that does not suit your appetite, there is the door. Leave now." Though no one scrambled to leave, a wave of cold realization washed over the faces of the old guard. Chief Arinze rose, adjusting his expensive jacket with slow, deliberate movements. He muttered that putting on a clean white shirt does not wash the mud from your hands. To which Kelechi calmly countered that it was precisely why they needed to stop digging in the dirt. Arinze locked eyes with him, a humorless grin returning to his lips. "You might share his blood, young man, but you do not possess his iron," he whispered, before walking out, his associates trailing behind him. Once the doors clicked shut, Blade, his highly skilled security chief and closest ally, emerged from the shadows. He warned that such disrespect would not go unpunished. You might be wondering if Kelechi's absolute confidence was genuine, or if it was just a shield against the wolves circling his throne. Turning to his trusted lieutenant, Kelechi asked if he was expected to beg for their approval. Blade shook his head, explaining that while begging was out of the question, humiliating men of their stature was an invitation for war. "They do not forgive public embarrassment," Blade warned. Grabbing his phone from the table, Kelechi dismissed the threat, stating he had no need for their forgiveness. Blade kept his gaze steady, warning that the elders would likely strike first before they lost their grip on the empire. Kelechi simply walked toward the exit, challenge burning in his heart as he told Blade to let them try. It was clear that the old guard had tolerated his words, but rejected his authority, and stripped of their influence, they would surely plot his downfall. Under a pitch-black night sky, Kelechi's armored convoy rolled past the massive iron gates of the estate, flanked by 2 heavily armed security vehicles. Blade sat alert in the front passenger seat, while Kelechi remained silent in the back, watching the streetlights of Lagos blur past. His mind was racing beneath that calm exterior. He understood that dismantling a criminal empire of this size meant cutting off the livelihoods of powerful men who had thrived in the shadows of his father's protection. Suddenly, the silence inside the vehicle was shattered by the sharp ring of Blade's phone, and his expression instantly went cold. Before Blade could even utter a warning, the night exploded into violence as a high-caliber bullet shattered the driver's side window. The luxury sedan swerved violently across the tarmac. "Get down now!" Blade screamed, drawing his weapon in a single fluid motion. Up ahead, a large white van lurched across the road, cutting off their escape as masked gunmen poured out, weapons blazing. Within seconds, a tailing vehicle rammed them from behind, locking the entire convoy in a deadly bottleneck. The impact sent Kelechi slamming hard against the interior panel, his head throbbing, but his focus sharp. Blade was already firing back, barking desperate orders to their security detail to cover the boss at all costs, as glass and metal rained down around them. A sudden searing heat blossomed in Kelechi's midsection, and looking down he saw a bright crimson stain rapidly soaking his designer shirt. Blade caught sight of the wound and gasped, but Kelechi hissed through clenched teeth that he was fine, ordering his man to focus on the threat. "Do not look at me, shoot back," he growled. Blade leaned out of the shattered window, releasing a volley of bullets to hold off the advancing shooters. The entire avenue descended into an absolute war zone of squealing tires, blinding gunsmoke, and chaotic shouting. Just then, an attacker lobbed an explosive device toward their lead escort vehicle, and a deafening blast tore through the front of the convoy, leaving their driver lifeless and slumped over the steering wheel. Thinking quickly, Blade hauled Kelechi out of the opposite door and pushed him toward the shadows, urging him to keep his head down. Kelechi attempted to steady himself, but his knees buckled as warm blood splashed onto the concrete beneath them. With bullets still snapping through the air, Blade managed to return fire with one hand, while slinging Kelechi's heavy frame over his shoulder with the other. They scrambled away from the highway, darting into a dark alleyway behind a row of shuttered market stalls. Kelechi lost his footing, but Blade caught him before he hit the ground, frantically suggesting they head to their private medical facility. Clenching his bleeding side, Kelechi gasped that a hospital was out of the question, as his vision began to fade. The sound of approaching footsteps in the dark confirmed that several of the hitmen were still on their trail, forcing them deeper into the maze of back streets. Emerging onto a quiet service road, Blade tried to summon backup, but his phone display showed no service, prompting a fierce curse. Slumping against a damp brick wall, Kelechi's face looked dangerously pale under the dim light as he weakly told Blade to run and draw the pursuers away from him. Blade stared at his boss in disbelief, flatly refusing to abandon him. But Kelechi insisted, pointing out that if they stayed together, they would both end up dead. "Go get the transport and double back," Kelechi ordered, his jaw set. Realizing the logic, Blade nodded and slipped away, praying his boss would survive. Let us turn our gaze to a quiet road not far from the chaos where a young woman's night was about to collide with a world she had always avoided. Blade had just vanished into the dark, firing a single round to lead the gunman away, leaving Kelechi to stagger blindly through the streets. His shirt was a soggy red mess, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. Stumbling into the middle of the road with blurred vision, he barely registered the headlights before a car horn wailed. The sedan screeched to a halt inches from him, and he collapsed heavily onto the hood before sinking to the pavement. Behind the steering wheel sat Zikora Okori, a compassionate 24-year-old nurse whose gentle nature was about to be put to the ultimate test. At the local clinic, Zikora was adored by everyone for her gentle touch and the deep respect she showed to the elderly patients. Earlier that day, her routine had started just like any other, waking up in their modest home in Lagos to the familiar smell of breakfast. In the kitchen, her mother, Mrs. Rose Okori, was busy fretting over the dangers of the city, haunted by the fear of losing another child to the chaotic streets. Meanwhile, her father, Inspector Daniel Okori, sat in the parlor, looking sharp and formidable in his starched police uniform. He was a disciplined officer who struggled to voice his deep affection for his daughter in words. Seeing her ready for her shift, the inspector stood up, grabbed his keys, and firmly insisted on driving her to work. A warm smile lit up Zikora's face as she tried to calm her father's endless fretting. If we look closely at this quiet home, we can see the deep love holding them together, though a storm is brewing. She softly reassured him that the hospital was not far, but Inspector Daniel was not easily swayed, grumbling that her safety was his only concern. She laughed, insisting she was capable of going alone. Just then, Mrs. Rose stepped out of the kitchen, urging her to let her father drive her. Zikora walked over and kissed her mother's cheek, joking that if he drove her daily, he would soon be interrogating patients. Daniel tried to look stern, but he looked at her with deep affection, seeing only the little girl who cried when he left for night duty. The light in Zikora's eyes dimmed slightly as the heavy shadow of the past crept into the room. They all knew the silent reason behind Daniel's suffocating protectiveness. Years ago, John Zikora's vibrant older brother had been stolen from them in Lagos, caught in the crossfire of a brutal gang war he had nothing to do with. Since that tragic night, the Okori household had been wrapped in grief. Her father grew unyielding, her mother became fragile, and Zikora threw herself into nursing, desperate to heal strangers as a cure for her own broken heart. She promised to be careful, receiving a tense nod from her father. Now, sitting in her sedan, she stared through the glass at a bleeding man on the dark road. A paralyzing wave of shock washed over Zikora, freezing her to her steering wheel. When her senses finally returned, sheer terror took over as she scanned the pitch-black stretch of the Lagos road. Her father had warned her countless times about how criminals used fake accidents as traps to ambush unsuspecting drivers. Shaking, she slammed the lockdown. Outside, the fallen man slowly raised his head, looking deadly despite his injuries. His face was ghostly pale, but filled with an intense, unbreakable pride, and dark blood soaked his shirt. As she reached for her phone with trembling fingers, he growled a low warning not to call anyone. Her fear turned to hot anger. He tried to stand, but agony dragged him back down. Instead of begging for help, the stranger rasped an angry command for her to drive away. Zakura stared, her mind spinning, as she watched the dark blood expand across his chest. Her self-preservation screamed at her to flee, but her medical training fought back harder. She was a nurse, and a dying human was right before her eyes. Stepping out into the humid night, she approached slowly. "Don't touch me," Kletchy hissed, but Zakura just glared in disbelief. "You are bleeding out on the asphalt and still trying to play the big man," she snapped. Ignoring his pride, she told him she had sworn an oath to save lives, even rude ones, and began inspecting the deep wound. The fierce stranger winced as her fingers touched him, but he did not pull away. Zakura warned him that he desperately needed a hospital, but he flatly refused, his voice turning ice cold. She looked closely at him now, noticing the ridiculously expensive watch on his wrist, his designer shoes, and the commanding aura of someone who owned the city. When she demanded to know who he was, he grunted that it was none of her business. He explained through labored breaths that a hospital would bring unwanted questions, and questions would only lead to more deaths. Zakura's chest tightened with sudden dread. Just then, the distant, unmistakable crack of another gunshot echoed through the quiet Lagos night. A sudden, icy dread washed over Zakura as the dark reality sank in. This man was not just a victim of an accident. He was actively being hunted by killers. Every logical instinct screamed at her to jump back into her sedan and speed away, leaving him to his fate. But as he swayed on his feet, his arrogant mask slipped, revealing a desperate human being on the edge of death. Zakura made a split-second choice. "Get in the back," she commanded, helping him as he stumbled and nearly collapsed. This time, his pride was gone, and he let her guide him. She sped off into the shadows of Lagos, bypassing the hospital to hide him in an abandoned, half-built concrete structure where no one would look. Hurrying to her trunk, Zakura grabbed the modest first aid kit she kept for emergencies. It was far too basic for a gunshot wound, but she had to slow the bleeding. Kletchy watched her through heavy eyelids as her hands moved with professional ease. She cleaned the dark blood from his side, pressing a thick cloth over the tear in his flesh and binding it tightly. "This is not treatment," she warned. "This is only to keep you alive until you get real help." He weakly joked that she talked too much, but she retorted that he bled too much. When the flow finally slowed, she sank back, exhausted, while Kletchy stared at her, amazed that she showed absolutely none of the terror or greed he usually saw in people. There was no fear in her eyes, no awe of his wealth, just a blunt mixture of professional concern and irritation. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper in the dusty room. Zakura packed the stained dressings back into her kit, replying simply that she was a nurse, and that was reason enough. Kletchy fell silent, utterly speechless for the first time in his adult life. She stood up, cleaning her hands with sanitizer, and warned him that whatever dangerous game he was playing, he needed to call his people immediately. Kletchy looked up at her, captivated by her strength, and quietly asked for her name. A brief hesitation hung in the dusty air as Zakura debated whether to trust him, but his softened tone disarmed her. "Zakura," she finally whispered. "Zakura Okori." He repeated it slowly, letting the syllables linger as if etching them into his memory. She never asked for his identity, a detail that would haunt Kletchy's thoughts for days. She had saved his life without care for his status, walking away before the terrifying name of Obiora could poison her opinion of him. As she drove off with shaking hands, Kletchy watched her taillights fade. He was bleeding and surrounded by enemies, yet his mind was entirely occupied by the fierce nurse who had treated him like a simple human being. She had not seen him as a ruthless mafia king or a monster, but simply as a man in need. For the first time in his life, Kletchy Obiora felt an overwhelming obsession take root, knowing he would stop at nothing to find her again. It was nearly 20 minutes later when his loyal lieutenant Blade finally tracked him down. Klecci was slumped against the cold concrete wall, pale and bleeding. Yet he held his head high as Blade and his men rushed inside. Blade knelt in a panic, scolding him for not waiting in the car, his eyes wide at the sight of the blood-soaked clothes. He urged Klecci to focus on surviving, but the boss merely ignored the frantic warnings. With a raspy breath, Klecci demanded to know if they had seen the woman who saved him. Blade frowned in confusion, reminding him that he was actively bleeding out and needed medical attention, not a distraction. But Klecci's voice hardened as he ordered him to find her. When Blade protested that they did not even know her identity, Klecci uttered her name, Zakura Okori. A heavy, tense silence fell over the room as Blade's face paled. He exchanged a worried glance with his men before explaining that an Inspector Daniel Okori was a known police officer in Lagos whose daughter was a nurse. Klecci's eyes narrowed in realization as Blade warned him of the extreme danger. The tension in the unfinished building peaked as Blade explained that the girl's father despised the Obiora family with a passion. Every cop in Lagos knew that Inspector Daniel's son had been killed years ago in a gang shooting tied to their syndicate. Klecci's faint smile vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, contemplative stare, as he ordered Blade to find her address. Despite his reservations, Blade knew better than to argue and simply nodded. Meanwhile, Zakura arrived home exhausted, desperately washing her hands to erase the memory of the stranger's blood. His piercing gaze and arrogant voice haunted her, and her observant mother noticed her unusual silence immediately. Watching from the kitchen doorway, Mrs. Rose Okori wiped her hands on a damp towel and asked her daughter if she was all right. Zakura forced a tired smile, claiming she was just exhausted from her shift. But Inspector Daniel, looking up from his old newspaper, immediately asked if anything unusual had happened on her drive home. Zakura hesitated for a split second before lying, assuring him everything was fine. Though her father sensed she was hiding something, he chose not to push. Their modest Lagos home was always filled with this quiet, suffocating warmth, where a strict but loving father and a mother who worried about everyone kept a constant protective watch over her. The unbearable pain of burying a child was a shadow that never truly left the Okori household. John, her lively and ever-laughing older brother, had been snatched away when a single stray bullet cut his life short during a gang shootout. Ever since that tragic day, Zakura had vowed never to bring any more fear or worry into her parents' lives, which was why she kept the bleeding stranger a secret. But as you and I already know, the danger she tried to avoid was already knocking at their door. The very next afternoon, two massive, tinted black SUVs pulled up in front of their home. Mrs. Rowe spotted them first, frantically calling Daniel to the window, whose face hardened with instant dread as he looked outside. A heavy, demanding knock cut through the tense silence of the house before anyone could speak. Zakura emerged from her bedroom, nervously asking who it was, but only silence greeted her. Stepping in front of his family, Inspector Daniel threw the door open to reveal Blade dressed in black, flanked by two men holding dark suitcases. Beside them stood Klecci, looking immaculate and powerful, showing no signs of his near-death experience. Zakura gasped in shock as Klecci's eyes softened for a brief moment. Daniel demanded to know if she knew this stranger, and she admitted she had helped him yesterday. Daniel then glared at the wealthy man, demanding his name, and was told this was Klecci Obiora. The moment the feared family name was uttered, the air in the modest Enugu living room turned ice cold. You and I can feel the absolute dread as Mrs. Rose gasped, her trembling hand flying to cover her mouth, while Inspector Daniel's expression hardened into granite. The name was Obiora. Kelechi gave a slow, deliberate nod of confirmation. The inspector snarled that men like him always claim peace before bringing ruin. Yet Kelechi insisted he only came to express gratitude to the daughter, Zikora's chest heaved with panic as she tried to dismiss him. But the wealthy visitor had other plans. Standing tall, he calmly announced his intention to claim Zikora as his wife, plunging the entire house into a heavy, suffocating silence. Dumbfounded Zikora could only gape at the wealthy man standing in her parlor. When Kelechi calmly restated his proposal, she let out a bitter, joyless laugh, born of pure disbelief, asking if he had lost his mind after meeting her just yesterday. Mrs. Rose desperately declared that her daughter would never join such a family. But Kelechi merely hinted at the unimaginable wealth he brought. With a quick gesture, his right-hand man Blade ordered the guards to open several heavy suitcases on the floor. Inside, stacks upon stacks of crisp, newly minted 1,000 naira notes gleamed in the dim light. Mrs. Rose recoiled in terror, while Zikora stared at the fortune, utterly paralyzed by this aggressive display of raw power. Promising an escape from their modest, struggling reality, Kelechi gestured to the overflowing wealth. He claimed this cash was only a fraction of what they would receive, promising that their family would never suffer poverty again. But Inspector Daniel was not a man to be bought, not when his heart still bled for his late son John, who was killed as an innocent bystander in one of the Obiora family's violent clashes. The inspector spat out his grief, accusing Kelechi's family of treating human lives like rubbish. Kelechi's jaw clenched, muttering that he was not in charge back then, though Daniel countered that the name itself carried a heavy curse. Desperate to end the madness, Zikora stepped forward and declared she was already engaged to Victor Adeniyi. Without a single shred of hesitation, Kelechi dismissed her engagement as if it were a minor inconvenience. Zikora's jaw dropped at his utter arrogance, shouting that she was not a piece of furniture to be moved around at his whim just because she had saved his life. Underneath his cold, calculating facade, Kelechi felt a sudden spark of intense fascination, though his outward composure never wavered. Inspector Daniel raised a shaking finger, ordering the wealthy criminal to take his dirty money and clear out of his home. Ignoring the old officer, Kelechi turned his piercing gaze back to the terrified young woman. He coolly granted her 3 days to prepare herself, leaving Zikora with a dry throat and her weeping mother trembling in absolute despair. Sensing the imminent violence, Zikora grabbed her father's arm just as his protective instincts almost drove him to strike Kelechi. The wealthy boss turned on his heel and strode out, followed by Blade and his heavily armed guards carrying the closed suitcases. Once the roar of the luxury engines faded into the distance, a heavy, suffocating silence blanketed the modest home. Zikora collapsed onto a chair, all strength draining from her body as her mother rushed to comfort her with panicked cries. While Daniel stood in the center of the parlor, breathing heavily, Mrs. Rose begged him to flee, but the proud former inspector fiercely refused to run from a criminal on his own soil. Seeing his daughter's sheer terror, however, the old man's stubborn face softened with profound worry.
"If that thug returns, let him face me in this very room," Daniel resolved. Later that evening, Victor arrived, his gentle heart shattered by the terrifying news. As a struggling local painter, Victor Adeniyi did not possess vast riches, but his soul was filled with bright dreams and a deep, patient love for Zikora. He was the kind of man who listened closely and believed in a better tomorrow. Hearing that Kelechi Obiora had physically invaded her home made his blood run cold with protective panic. He suggested reporting the threat, but the old inspector scoffed, knowing that half the police force fed greedily from Kelechi's hand. Desperate, Victor pleaded that they must wed immediately to shield her. A desperate logic drove Victor's argument, believing that a marriage certificate would act as a shield against Kelechi's threats. Inspector Daniel turned away in silent anguish, hating the thought of rushing his daughter into marriage out of fear, yet finding no other way out. Mrs. Rose wiped her cheeks, questioning if this was truly their best option. Clutching Zikora's hands, Victor swore his devotion and vowed to protect her with his life. Zikora searched her parents' eyes,
seeing her mother's trembling form and her father's exhausted pride. Realizing they were cornered, she quietly agreed to the rushed wedding. Victor exhaled in immense relief, planning a tiny, quiet family ceremony with zero fanfare. Though she gave a slow nod of agreement, a cold knot of dread remained tight in Zikora's chest. She desperately hoped that becoming another man's wife would deter Kelechi, naive to the reality that wealthy, powerful men in Lagos do not care about wedding rings. The very next afternoon, Kelechi stormed into the clinic where she worked as a nurse. The hospital director, Dr. Samuel Briggs, loved medical ethics, but worshipped wealthy donors far more. When the powerful man walked in with his security detail, the busy lobby fell dead silent. Smelling money, Dr. Briggs rushed out of his office with a wide, sycophantic smile. Instantly starstruck as Kelechi promised a massive donation to fund an entire new emergency ward, state-of-the-art machines, and staff bonuses. Stunned by the astronomical sum, Dr. Briggs felt his breath catch in his throat. He stammered out his gratitude while Kelechi turned a cold, possessive gaze toward the nursing station where Zikora stood paralyzed. To her utter horror, Kelechi smoothly announced to the entire room that the generous donation was his beautiful fiancé's idea. Dozens of eyes instantly locked onto Zikora, whose heart hammered in panic as she desperately cried out that Kelechi was not her fiancé. But her protests fell on deaf ears. Dr. Briggs was already blinded by the promise of wealth, eagerly offering Kelechi whatever he wanted. When the billionaire requested Zikora's company for the day, the director ignored her pleas and ordered her to comply. Arguing that she was in the middle of her nursing shift, Zikora desperately tried to maintain her professional boundary. But Dr. Briggs dismissed her instantly, promising to authorize immediate leave as Kelechi cornered her with cold intent. In the deadly silence of the ward, she tried to storm off, but Blade reacted like lightning, gesturing to two muscle-bound guards who blocked her escape. She shrieked at them not to lay a hand on her, causing Blade to hesitate for a split second before enforcing his boss's orders. No one raised a finger to help as they hauled her through the corridors. Not her close colleagues, not the security guards at the gate, nor the director himself. In that terrifying moment, a bitter truth dawned on her. She realized with sickening clarity that a thick stack of bills could instantly blind even the most decent souls. Soon after, Kelechi brought her to the staggering Obiora estate, a massive fortress far larger than anything she had ever set eyes upon. High metal gates and a sprawling compound led to a marble mansion that practically oozed silent, ruthless authority. As they walked through the grand entrance, Kelechi offered to make this palace her home. Zikora merely crossed her arms defensively, stating her modest house held something this mansion lacked: genuine peace. Undeterred, Kelechi promised endless fleets of luxury cars, servants, and protection. Zikora could only scoff, questioning if he truly believed every soul had a price. With cold certainty, Kelechi replied that almost everything in this world indeed has a price tag. Pity welled up inside Zikora, and she told him so, ignoring his low, warning snarl. Her voice shook with unshed tears, yet she fiercely pushed on, telling the feared billionaire that despite his immense wealth, he was emotionally bankrupt. She exposed his delusion, pointing out that forced obedience is never respect, and that love cannot be bought. Kelechi stared at her, stunned as she accused him of treating a sacred marriage like a simple business transaction. Though a flash of irritation crossed his mind, it quickly transformed into a deep, intense fascination. No woman had ever dared to look past his power and speak to him with such raw honesty. He had never encountered someone who held deep terror in her eyes, yet spoke with such unshakable conviction. But before he could respond, a cold voice drifted down from the grand staircase, announcing her arrival. Zikora turned to see Madame Patricia Obiora descending slowly, her elegant lace flowing around her as she eyed Zecora like cheap property. Ever since marrying Kelechi's late father, she had worn the family name like a royal crown. Right behind her was Susan Obiora, her beautiful but sharp-tongued daughter, who believed her pedigree made her superior to anyone else. Staring down her nose, Patricia reminded Kelechi that his late father had expected him to marry a high-class woman of equal social standing, not an ordinary girl. Refusing to even look at his stepmother, Kelechi simply declared that his decision was final. Susan's eyes narrowed in anger, while Zecora quickly realized she was standing in the middle of a snake pit. Seizing the opportunity, Zecora announced she would happily leave, since the family clearly agreed she did not belong. To her surprise, Kelechi agreed, ordering Blade to escort her home safely. He added a chilling warning that this release was only temporary, a phrase that made her stomach churn. The moment Zecora departed, Patricia erupted, demanding to know how he could seriously pursue such an ordinary girl. Kelechi's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, warning her never to speak of Zecora that way again, before he walked off, whispering in the empty corridor. Susan warned her mother that Kelechi's actions threatened their entire livelihood. You and I can see the cold panic setting in, as Patricia knew that since Kelechi was not her biological son, any marriage would strip them of their influence. Her face contorted with malice as she ordered Susan to dig up dirt on the girl. By the very next morning, Susan had compiled a complete dossier on Zecora Okori. She discovered she was a simple clinic nurse daughter of a retired police officer and pledged to a broke artist named Victor Adeniyi. Disgusted by this cheap connection, Susan slammed the file in front of Patricia, scoffing that Kelechi was intentionally bringing shame to the family name by choosing such a commoner. Determined to stop the marriage, Susan shook her head in fierce agreement with her mother. Meanwhile, across town, Victor was facing an emotional storm with his mother, Mrs. Grace Adami. Having worked her fingers to the bone, Grace knew that crossing powerful elites in Nigeria meant ruin. When Victor announced a sudden wedding, her love erupted into pure panic, and she screamed, asking if he had lost his mind. Victor pleaded his love, but Grace warned him that affection could not protect them from a ruthless billionaire like Kelechi Obiora. Despite her warning that a single phone call from such a man could erase their lives, Victor stood his ground to shield Zecora. Sensing his absolute resolve, a cold fear settled deep in Grace's soul. It was not a deep-seated hatred for Zecora that drove her actions, but rather a paralyzing terror that this love would end up ruining Victor's entire future. To understand this, you and I have to look closely at the choices they had to make. Because of this looming threat, both families agreed to hold a small, private, traditional wedding. There would be no lavish event hall, no roaring crowd, just a modest gathering of immediate relatives. Everything was rushed through. Inspector Daniel harbored deep resentment, having always dreamed of walking his daughter down the aisle with pride rather than dread. Yet he placed his faith in Victor, who visited his bride-to-be on the eve of their union, holding her hands as he promised to make things right one day. Looking at him with heavy, exhausted eyes, Zecora felt the weight of their uncertain future pressing down on her. She insisted that a grand celebration meant nothing to her, but Victor passionately disagreed, declaring his dream to become a renowned painter whose hard work would secure them a beautiful life. She offered a frail smile and claimed she believed him, though in truth, her inner confidence was completely shattered. Before Victor could depart, a sudden sharp knock rattled the front door. Zecora's chest tightened instantly, her instincts warning her of who it was before she even saw him. There stood Kelechi, alone and imposing. Inspector Daniel immediately blocked the entrance, growling, "You again." But the intruder only had eyes for Zecora, demandingly asking to speak with her. Zecora quietly urged her father to let him speak so they could finally get rid of him. Though Daniel despised the idea, he reluctantly stepped aside, allowing Kelechi to linger near the doorframe, with his eyes fixed on the young woman. He coolly claimed to know far more about her than she realized, a statement that made her entire body tense up in defensive fear. When he brought up her late brother, her expression faltered completely. Her father's hand clenched into a tight fist as he warned him never to speak of his son. Kelechi defended himself, saying he had personally investigated the tragedy, but Zecora snapped back, pointing out that his investigation came far too late. She reminded him bitterly that people of his kind only claim to change after innocent blood has dried and lives are lost. Kelechi met her accusations with a heavy, unreadable silence. She pressed on, telling him that even if he did not pull the trigger himself, the blood of innocence was on his hands, due to the corrupt power he enjoyed and the silence he inherited. Although a flicker of emotion crossed his face, he quickly masked it, asserting that he was not like his father. Yet she pointed out the hypocrisy of him standing in her family home, attempting to steal whatever he wanted, just like his predecessor. He stared at her in silence, before delivering a chilling, quiet ultimatum. 3 days, Zecora. Ignoring her wedding plans, his eyes drifted to Victor, who tried to stand tall but failed to hide his sheer terror. Kelechi noted this weakness with cold amusement, before focusing back on Zecora. With a cold, dismissive remark, Kelechi flatly rejected her marriage plans before turning on his heel to leave. Zecora remained frozen, her chest tight, unable to catch her breath, until the sound of his car faded into the distance. Victor rushed to her side, squeezing her hand, and proposing they hold the ceremony the very next morning to beat his timeline. She nodded, but as darkness fell over their home, an intense dread lingered in the air. Kelechi had not yelled or made dramatic threats. He had spoken with the calm certainty of a man who believed the script was already written. In his mind, it was an absolute fact that Zecora Akori would be his wife. When dawn broke, she woke up early, momentarily forgetting the chaos before the crushing reality of the day rushed back. Perched on the side of her mattress, Zecora tightly clasped her hands in a silent prayer. Her chest heaved as her heart raced far too rapidly for a morning that was supposed to usher in a lifetime of peace. There was a glaring absence of traditional bridal joy in the house. No loud music echoing, no friends sharing light-hearted jokes, and no women bustling about in colorful matching aso-ebi fabrics. An eerie, heavy quiet hung over the rooms. She slipped into a modest cream dress, her mother, Mrs. Rose, struggling to pull up the zipper with trembling fingers. Turning around, Zecora noticed the tears spilling down her mother's face. She begged her not to cry. But the older woman wept, mourning the fact that her daughter's big day was filled with anxiety instead of pure happiness. Pulling her close, Mrs. Rose embraced her daughter with a desperate protective tightness. Out in the living room, Inspector Daniel Akori stood tall in his freshly pressed clothes, though he looked like a man silently carrying a massive boulder on his chest. You and I can feel the absolute dread in that room, a space normally reserved for family laughter. When Zecora finally stepped out, his stern features softened instantly at the sight of her. He looked at her with deep sorrow, lamenting that she was being forced into marriage out of sheer terror. Zecora walked over, taking his calloused hand and whispering that she trusted Victor. But her father remained unconvinced. While he certainly favored Victor over a tyrant like Kelechi, this was not the future he wanted. No self-respecting father could ever be at peace with his daughter marrying under the shadow of a ruthless man's 3-day ultimatum. The modest ceremony took place in a small, secluded hall that Victor's family had frantically rented. The room was mostly empty, save for a handful of witnesses. Standing at the altar in a plain suit, Victor was a bundle of nerves, but his face lit up the moment Zecora walked in. He eagerly grasped her hand as she arrived beside him, whispering his relief that she had actually shown up. She offered a quiet reply, asking where else she could possibly go. He smiled, promising that after today, they would be inseparable. The pastor cleared his throat to begin, but even his experienced voice could not mask the profound unease felt by everyone present. An unspoken, suffocating panic filled the air, though everyone tried their best to pretend everything was normal. Inspector Daniel stood rigidly beside his weeping wife, forcing himself to remain upright. Across the aisle, Victor's mother, Mrs. Grace Adami, sat as stiff as a board, her hands rubbing together in obsessive anxiety as she kept glancing at the entrance. Her dreadful premonitions were proven right when, just as the pastor reached the vows, the heavy doors swung open. A freezing draft seemed to sweep through the room as Kelechi Oyora stepped inside, flanked by Blade and a small army of silently menacing men in dark suits. A collective gasp echoed, and Mrs. Rose choked back a sob. Victor gripped Zikora's hand in a vice, his heart sinking as Kelechi demanded to know where he found his courage. With a trembling but defiant voice, Victor asserted that this was his wedding day. Kelechi merely sneered, mockingly pointing out that the woman standing beside him was his own intended bride, making the ceremony a complete sham. In a display of raw independence, Zikora yanked her hand free from Victor's grasp, stepping directly into the path of the dangerous man to declare she was not his wife. Before she could say more, Inspector Daniel shielded his daughter fiercely, stating his authority as a police officer and warning against these illegal threats. Kelechi was entirely unfazed, coldly reminding the lawman that real power does not always wear a uniform. As Daniel's jaw clenched in silent fury, Kelechi turned to his right-hand man, Blade, and ordered him to lock the doors. When the heavy doors clicked shut, locking them inside, Mrs. Rose burst into helpless tears. Victor looked around the room, feeling completely stripped of power, as he yelled that they had no right to do this. Kelechi paid him no mind, gesturing to two of his armed guards who carried heavy suitcases forward. They tossed them onto the floor, popping the latches to reveal stacks of crisp banknotes packed tightly inside. The sight of such immense wealth caused Mrs. Grace's terrified expression to melt into pure shock. Kelechi coldly offered the fortune to Victor, telling him to take it and walk away from Zikora forever. Victor's face burned with intense rage as he rejected the offer, shouting that money could never purchase genuine love, a sentiment that Kelechi met with mock amusement. Desperately searching Victor's face, Zikora prayed with all her heart that his resolve would not crumble. Suddenly, Victor's mother stood up, her voice trembling as she called out to him. Despite his protests, Mrs. Grace stared at the deadly weapons aimed in their direction, then at the cash, and finally at her only child. She implored him to listen to reason, arguing that while love is a beautiful thing, when one is alive, it holds no value in a graveyard, and she refused to bury him. When Victor asked if she expected him to sell his bride, she cried out that she simply wanted him to survive, refusing to lose her only son to someone else's war. Zikora felt those brutal words like a physical blow, yet she knew it was sheer paralyzing terror speaking through the woman. Glancing once more at the overflowing suitcases, Victor then turned his gaze toward Zikora, as a look of defeat washed over him. He managed to utter a refusal, claiming he would not take the bribe, but the noticeable crack in his voice betrayed his dwindling resolve. Kelechi observed this weakness with a knowing smirk. Enraged, Inspector Daniel pointed directly at the cash, demanding they take their filthy wealth out of the building. His voice trembled with righteous anger as he told Kelechi that while he could buy the loyalty of cowards and purchase fake respect, he would never buy his daughter. Kelechi remained silent, slowly pulling a plush velvet box from his jacket to reveal a sparkling, priceless necklace before presenting it to Zikora. With disgust evident on her face, Zikora stared at the dazzling jewelry before looking directly into the eyes of her tormentor. She flatly rejected the gift, but he insisted, his gaze darkening with a quiet fury when she refused again. She stood her ground, looking him dead in the eye, as she told him he could keep his expensive gems, his piles of money, and his endless intimidation tactics, but he would never force her to love him. An intense, heavy silence fell over the small hall. Kelechi slowly snapped the velvet box shut, stepping back while calmly stating that he still expected her family's formal blessing. Daniel let out a harsh, mocking laugh, telling the criminal he would wait until his hair turned gray, to which Kelechi replied that her 3 days were not yet up. When the heavy entrance doors swung open once more, the air in the room remained thick with a sense of utter defeat. The rushed wedding was officially dead, prompting the somber pastor to close his book without a word. Victor stood frozen, feeling thoroughly humiliated and exposed before everyone he loved. Zipporah, however, shed no tears. She merely stared at the floor as a cold, unyielding resolve took root deep inside her. Now, you and I can see the exact moment the tide began to turn in her heart. When her mother embraced her, she quietly vowed that she would never be bought. True to her word, when Kelechi sent a massive delivery of luxury gifts to her home that night, she did not hesitate. The next morning, she walked into an anti-terrorism office to donate every single item in his name. With a polite nod, the clerk accepted the generous contribution, completely unaware of the political storm it was about to unleash. The scandalous news spread like wildfire through the streets, sparking intense debate across social media. While some gullible citizens praised Kelechi's apparent generosity, those in the know laughed hysterically at how a simple nurse had completely outsmarted the city's most feared kingpin. By midday, the humiliating report had reached the massive Obiora estate. Kelechi stood silently in his private study, watching the anchor detail his supposed charity work on his screen. Overcome by a wave of cold fury, he hurled his phone violently against the wall, shattering it. Blade remained still as Kelechi asked, "She donated my gifts in my own name?" Let's step into this dark world together and look at Kelechi, who let out a short, humorless laugh that echoed coldly through the massive room. He could not shake the feeling that Zipporah was mocking him. Beside him, Blade stood in silence. Kelechi turned his eyes, turning hard as flint. "Find her," he snapped. Blade cleared his throat, explaining she had resigned from the hospital that morning, leaving only a brief letter. Kelechi's face twisted in rage. "Search everywhere," he ordered, knowing her family would try to hide her. After Blade left, Kelechi stood alone, reflecting on how his desire for Zipporah had mutated from gratitude to an obsession. She was the only woman who dared to say no. Zipporah had bruised his fragile pride in front of his crew, his relatives, and the entire city. Yet whenever Kelechi closed his eyes, the memory of her on that dark Enugu road returned, her gentle hands stitching his deep wound without fear. She had cared for him without knowing his wealth or power. To him, a rare treasure like her was meant to be owned, and Kelechi Obiora never let go of what he claimed. Meanwhile, inside the modest Akori home, a quiet panic was rising. Mrs. Rose desperately begged her daughter to flee to her aunt's place in the province until the storm blew over. But Zipporah stood firm, knowing that if she ran, Kelechi would unleash his wrath on her parents. Sitting in his favored armchair, Inspector Daniel Okori looked older than his years, his expression weighed down by decades of fighting injustice. He knew men like Kelechi fed on fear, warning his daughter that terror was the tyrant's ultimate weapon. Zipporah confessed her terror, but her father reached out and took her trembling hand, promising they would face the danger together. A few days later, the Lagos Police Command hosted a glamorous gala. Elite officers, wealthy businessmen, and eager journalists filled the hall, where Kelechi arrived looking like an honorable citizen. While many officers swallowed their disgust, a fierce young sergeant named Musa glared at him with open hostility. Sergeant Musa felt his stomach turn as he watched Commissioner Bamadel fawn over the notorious crime lord. The commissioner was a slick politician in uniform, known for his expensive tastes and crooked deals, fearing influential men far more than the laws of Nigeria. When Bombadil loudly declared how honored they were by Kelechi's presence, Musa could no longer contain his rage and stepped forward. He boldly questioned why the force was honoring a man whose fortune was built on blood and pain. The festive hall fell into a suffocating silence as a panicked Bombadil ordered the young officer to shut his mouth. But Musa refused to be silenced, shouting that monsters like Kelechi were the real reason everyday citizens lived in terror. A chilling smile spread across Kelechi's face as he stared at the defiant young officer with absolute calm. He turned his gaze to the nervous commissioner and casually asked if this was the troublesome officer they had discussed earlier. Musa's bold confidence instantly turned into confusion as Kelechi produced a thick document. It contained fabricated evidence of embezzlement, illegal bribes, and forged bank receipts, all pinned on the young sergeant. As Musa's face drained of color, Kelechi softly suggested that the commissioner examine his so-called honest officer. Two armed guards quickly grabbed the struggling young man, ignoring his desperate cries of a setup as they dragged him out. This ruthless display of power unfolded right before the eyes of the city's elite, leaving them in no doubt that Kelechi could ruin an officer of the law with a single whisper. His next target was already chosen, and the trap for Inspector Daniel Akori was set with terrifying precision. A mysterious folder materialized, falsely linking Daniel to millions of naira he had never even seen. The fabricated evidence was so airtight that his closest allies shrank away in fear. Soon, federal agents arrived at the Akori home with an arrest warrant, forcing Daniel to whisper a final plea for courage to his weeping wife. When the devastating news reached Zecora, her world shattered, and she began a desperate search for legal help. A wall of rejection met Zecora at every turn, as prestigious lawyers slammed their doors the moment Kelechi's name was mentioned. The few who did not refuse outright demanded exorbitant fees that her family could never afford in a lifetime. Finally, an older attorney looked at her with genuine pity, warning her that the conspiracy was far too massive, and that only a man of immense influence could save her father. Zecora knew there was only one person with that kind of power. That evening, swallowing her pride, she walked toward Kelechi's grand estate, hating the very ground she trod upon. Blade escorted her to where Kelechi waited, his dark eyes watching her as she desperately croaked out that her father was innocent. If we look closely at Kelechi now, we see a predator enjoying his victory as he slowly leans back in his plush leather chair. He mockingly asked if that was the only reason she had finally crawled back to him. Zecora pleaded for her father, swallowing her disgust to beg for mercy. But Kelechi merely tilted his head coldly, demanding that she address him by name. Her stomach churned with hatred as she whispered his first name, but he shook his head, wanting more than just a casual word. He wanted her total submission. Realizing her father was rotting in a cold cell because of this monster, she suppressed her rage and addressed him as Mr. Obiora. A wave of dark satisfaction washed over Kelechi as he commanded her to say it again, savoring the sound of her defeat. Zecora's fingernails dug deep into her palms as she repeated her plea, begging Mr. Obiora to save her father. Standing up, he slowly closed the distance between them, whispering that she already knew the price of her father's freedom. He claimed he was offering her a choice, but they both knew he had systematically destroyed every other path. Tears of pure hatred spilled down her cheeks as she looked away, loathing his calm demeanor and his absolute control over her father's destiny. When she returned to her family home, she found Daniel temporarily released, though the threat still loomed heavy. Looking fragile and broken, the old inspector sat in his dimly lit parlor, the weight of his ruined career crushing his shoulders. Zecora knelt before him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, as she took his worn hands. Daniel looked into her eyes and immediately guessed the terrible bargain she had struck, flatly refusing to let her sacrifice her youth for his freedom. But Zecora explained that Kelechi had left them no escape. The old man wept, wondering aloud how his own daughter could marry the very brand of criminal he had spent his entire career putting behind bars. She squeezed his hand tightly, whispering that this was not about love, but absolute survival, leaving her father to close his eyes in defeat. In the corner of the room, Mrs. Rose buried her face in her wrapper, weeping silently for the bitter path her daughter was forced to walk. Later that night, a weary Victor arrived at the house, bags under his eyes, showing his sleepless worry over the family's plight. He desperately offered to help, proposing to sell his precious art collection at any price just to raise the legal fees. Zecora's heart broke for him, knowing that the corrupt lawyers were demanding sums beyond his wildest dreams. He squeezed her cold hands, begging her not to give up on their love, but she could only look at him in silent agony. Meanwhile, across town, Victor's mother raged when she discovered his plan to liquidate his art. Mrs. Grace shrieked in disbelief, her voice echoing off the walls of the tiny, cramped art studio where Victor stood surrounded by his life's work. He pleaded with her, explaining that Daniel was in grave danger, but she bitterly pointed out that association with Zecora's family had brought them nothing but chaos. When Victor demanded to know what had happened to the traditional wedding money Kelechi had brought to their family, Grace gasped and recoiled in shock. She realized with horror that her son wanted to use Kelechi's own money to save his rival's beloved. She flatly refused, determined to protect her son from his own foolish nobility, while Victor stood his ground. Grace fiercely grabbed her son's arms, swearing she would not stand by and watch him destroy himself for a hopeless romance. She warned him that Kelechi was a predator, and anyone standing between him and Zecora would be ground to dust. Looking at the beautiful, worthless canvases lining his studio, Victor felt a crushing sense of insignificance wash over him. He desperately wanted to be her savior, but he possessed no wealth, no political influence, and no powerful family name to shield them. He had nothing but his love for Zecora, and in the harsh light of Kelechi's brutal empire, he realized that love was a tragically fragile weapon that could save absolutely no one. The following afternoon, a luxury sedan pulled up outside the Okori residence, and Susan Obiora stepped out, flanked by a burly driver. Clutching a thick envelope stuffed with cash, she marched to the door, radiating wealth, her expensive perfume acting as a shield for her cold, arrogant demeanor. When Zecora opened the door, Susan scanned her with deep disdain, mocking her appearance before introducing herself. Zecora's expression immediately hardened into a defensive mask as she recognized her visitor. She stood tall, refusing to be intimidated by the wealthy intruder, while Susan prepared to use her family's endless fortune to sweep this middle-class obstacle out of her brother's life. Zecora demanded to know her business, only for Susan to thrust the money forward, ordering her to take the bribe and disappear from Kelechi's life. Zecora let out a dry, bitter laugh, suggesting that Susan direct her warnings to her obsessive brother instead. Susan sneered, accusing Zecora of playing the victim while secretly plotting to claw her way into high society. Overhearing the insults, Mrs. Rose marched out of the kitchen and warned the young woman to watch her mouth. But Susan merely scoffed, asking if Mrs. Rose had personally trained her daughter in the art of trapping rich men. Shocked by the utter disrespect, Rose's hand flew to a nearby glass of cold water. With a swift motion, Mrs. Rose threw the water directly into Susan's face, leaving her gasping and humiliated. Screaming in fury, Susan lunged forward with her hand raised, but Zecora blocked the blow, and in the chaotic struggle that followed, a sharp slap echoed through the room. Susan stood frozen, clutching her burning cheek in sheer disbelief that anyone would dare touch her. Zecora, chest heaving with adrenaline, pointed to the door and ordered her to leave. Humiliated and weeping, Susan snatched her envelope and fled back to the Obiora mansion, her mind filled with plans for total revenge. If you and I were there, we would have felt the cold dread of what was to come next. With a sneer, Patricia declared that the young woman was simply not fit for their prestigious family. Kelechi's eyes turned icy, and he snapped that he had never requested her opinion. Staring back in bitter disbelief, Patricia held her tongue. He turned to leave the parlor, but stopped when he overheard two housemaids whispering near the wide hallway of the Leckie mansion. They gossiped about how a common nurse could get so lucky, suggesting she had used juju on him. Kelechi turned around slowly, making the servants freeze in terror. When he demanded they say it again, silence filled the corridor. His low voice carried a terrifying weight as he promised that the woman they mocked was the one he would marry, warning that anyone who disrespected Zecora would be thrown out with nothing. Trembling, the servants quickly murmured their agreement. But Kelechi's gaze was already sweeping across the room to ensure both Patricia and Susan felt the full weight of his warning. He made it clear that Zecora would be respected as his wife. While Susan lowered her eyes to hide the burning hatred within her, Patricia remained silent, her pride deeply wounded. As Kelechi walked away, everyone in the Grand Obiora compound understood one thing. He was ready to fight his own blood for this woman. Patricia watched his retreating figure with a bitter heart, remembering the years of respect, expensive luxury cars, and elite parties she had enjoyed under the Obiora name. Now, because of a simple nurse, her own son treated her like a stranger. Susan stood close to her mother, her chest still heaving with anger over the embarrassing scene at Zecora's modest home. She warned that if the girl was allowed into the family, they would lose everything, pointing out how Kelechi was already treating her like a queen before marriage. Patricia's eyes hardened into cold stones as she remarked that even blind men can lose what they hold. When Susan asked what their next move should be, Patricia stared down the empty hallway where Kelechi had gone, declaring they would eliminate the problem before any vows were made. That night, Patricia made a discreet phone call to Pablo Eze, a dangerous, greedy fixer who operated only in the shadows of the city's criminal underbelly. In the past, Pablo had done dirty work for associates of the Obiora family, until Kelechi ruthlessly cut him off to sanitize the family empire. Pablo harbored a deep grudge because of it, so when Patricia brought up Zecora, he chuckled darkly through the receiver. He mocked how the great Kelechi had finally revealed a weakness, promising that for the right amount of money, any person could be made to vanish completely. Patricia closed her eyes, demanding he do it quietly, but such dark arrangements rarely remained secret. 2 days later, Zecora stepped out at dawn to consult a lawyer, her spirit crushed by her father's ongoing legal battle, which hung over them like a curse. Clutching her purse against her chest, Zecora cautiously made her way across a chaotic intersection in the heart of Lagos. Suddenly, the terrifying roar of an accelerating engine echoed through the air. A massive delivery truck swerved violently toward her, prompting a bystander to scream in terror. Before she could react, the truck slammed into a parked vehicle, sending jagged glass and twisted metal flying as Zecora was thrown violently to the asphalt. Pain ripped through her limbs when her head struck the curb, the chaotic noise fading into absolute blackness. Minutes later, the grim news reached Kelechi's office, where Blade walked in with a grim expression to announce a terrible accident. That brief moment of hesitation from Blade was all Kelechi needed to realize the truth. He demanded to know where Zecora was, but the room went deathly quiet when Blade whispered that there were no survivors. For the very first time, the powerful man looked utterly defeated, unable to process the devastating news. Refusing to believe it, he grabbed his keys and bolted out of the building like a madman, his bodyguards struggling to keep up. When they arrived at the chaotic scene, police officers were cordoning off the blood-stained road. Then Kelechi's heart shattered as he spotted a familiar, ruined handbag lying in the dirt. Recognizing it instantly as Zecora's. Frantic and desperate, Kelechi demanded her location as an officer tried to block his path. The policeman urged him to remain calm, but Kelechi roared in his face, warning him never to tell him to calm down. Blade quickly intervened to prevent his boss from committing murder on the spot. Striding past them, Kelechi grabbed the trembling truck driver, who was cowering on the asphalt. When asked who sent him, the driver sobbed that his brakes had simply failed. But Kelechi hissed that if Zecora was dead, his life was officially over, even as Blade warned that the public was watching. Releasing his grip, Kelechi gasped for air as he ordered Blade to find every single person behind the incident. Blade nodded obediently, leaving Kelechi to stare at the blood on the asphalt. Let us think about this for a second. Despite all his wealth and power, none of it could buy back a single breath if Zecora was truly gone. He had once wanted to possess her, to conquer her spirit, but now he only longed to hear her sharp tongue and see her alive. What Kelechi did not know was that Victor had already rescued her. He had been nearby when the crash happened, and hearing that a young woman was hurt, rushed to find her, weak but still breathing. A sudden wave of panic washed over Victor as he realized the danger of taking her to a public hospital, where Kelechi's men were bound to search. Thinking fast, he bundled her into a taxi and headed to his private art studio behind his mother's house. The small room was packed with half-finished canvases and old paintbrushes, a testament to his unsold dreams. When his mother, Mrs. Grace, saw him carrying the bleeding girl inside, she gasped in pure horror, asking if he wanted them all killed. Victor pleaded that she needed urgent help, but Grace scolded that he should have let Kelechi's network find her, staring at the girl with dread in her eyes. Convinced that the strange girl would bring ruin to their family, Grace watched in despair as Victor ignored her warnings. He carefully cleaned Zecora's wounds before calling a trusted young doctor to treat her in absolute secrecy. By nightfall, Zecora finally fluttered her eyes open, looking around the unfamiliar space in a dazed confusion. Victor gently explained she was in his studio after a bad accident, assuring her that her parents were currently safe. When she tried to sit up, a sharp pain shot through her, forcing her back down. As Victor comforted her, she heard Grace sobbing on the phone outside, terrified that Kelechi would murder her son if he found them. Closing her eyes in deep guilt, Zecora knew she could not allow this innocent family to pay the price for her presence. When Victor stepped out to buy medicine, she forced her aching, bruised body out of the bed and slipped quietly into the night. She had no destination, only a desperate desire to protect her savior. However, Kelechi's web of informants stretched across every corner of the city. By sunrise, a lookout spotted her near an informal roadside clinic, alerting Blade immediately. Within minutes, a sleek black sedan screeched to a halt right in front of where Zecora sat shivering, and Kelechi stepped out, staring in disbelief at the girl he thought he had lost. There she was, battered and fragile, yet undeniably breathing right in front of his eyes. An unfamiliar expression washed over Kelechi's face, devoid of his usual arrogance or ruthless control, replaced instead by a relief so profound it mirrored agony. He approached her slowly, calling her name as she tried to scramble away. When he reached out, she snapped at him to stay away, wishing she had truly died instead of being found by him. Angered but desperate, he insisted on taking her home for her own safety. But Zecora spat back that she was far safer anywhere else than in his cold custody, causing his jaw to tighten with rising frustration. With fierce defiance in her eyes, Zecora declared she would gladly choose death over a wedding with him. Hearing those words, Kelechi's briefly softened face hardened back into a frozen mask, as he warned that if he could not have her, nobody would. She challenged him to kill her right then, a threat that shook him more than he cared to admit. He ordered Blade to put her in the vehicle, ignoring her weak struggles as she was forced inside and driven back to the mansion. Later that evening, she stood shivering in a luxurious bedroom when Kelechi entered, locking the door and causing her to retreat in terror. Trembling against the wall, Zikora warned him to keep his distance, but he only pressed closer. He demanded to know why she kept running, to which she snapped that it was because he refused to stop hunting her down like prey. When he reached out to touch her face, she flinched away, leaving his hands suspended in the tense air. A dark battle raged inside him, between his raw desire to possess her and the realization of what he was doing. Looking into her eyes, he did not see her usual stubborn defiance, but a profound, genuine terror that made him recoil. Stepping back, his voice softened as he promised he would not force her, adjusting his jacket to regain his composure. Coldly, he announced they would wait for their wedding night, leaving Zikora feeling utterly sick to her stomach. Before walking out, he delivered a final warning that her parents would pay dearly if she ever tried to escape again. Left alone in the gilded cage of his mansion, she knew she had to surrender, agreeing to the marriage the next morning. This was not out of love, but because her father's legal case vanished the moment she complied. When Inspector Daniel returned home, free but broken, too ashamed to look his daughter in the eye, Zikora squeezed his hand and whispered that he had protected her. We can see the tragic irony here. She had traded her own freedom to buy his. The dawn of the wedding day arrived far too quickly, and as we look closely at this forced celebration, we can see that Kelechi spared no expense to make it grand. Wealthy businessmen, corrupt politicians, and powerful military officers gathered just to be near the prestigious Obiora name. Zikora stood in her elegant white gown, looking breathtaking, though her eyes were hollow and devoid of joy. Mrs. Rose wept silently in the corner, while Inspector Daniel stood protectively close, terrified his daughter might vanish if he blinked. Zikora turned to them before they walked. "Walk with me together," she whispered, wanting to ease her father's pain. Her father closed his eyes, and they each took one of her arms. With heavy steps, the parents escorted their precious daughter toward a man who felt like a curse to their family. Kelechi stood at the altar, looking like royalty, his calm face betraying none of his cruelty. His intense gaze locked on Zikora, as if the rest of the crowded room had dissolved. Nearby stood Victor, looking completely shattered. Mrs. Gray sat beside him, clutching her handbag with white knuckles, while desperately whispering prayers for a miracle. As the priest began the holy matrimony, Zikora stood beside her captor, her chest heaving with terror. None of the guests realized that she had slipped her father's gun into her dress hours earlier. Right before the vows could start, she drew the weapon. The entire hall gasped in absolute horror as Mrs. Rose shrieked. All eyes fell on Zikora as she aimed the cold metal barrel directly at Kelechi's chest. Although her hands trembled, her eyes burned with absolute determination. "I would rather die right here than spend my life married to you," she declared. Victor suddenly stood up, pleading frantically for her to stop. Kelechi merely let out a soft, amused sigh, telling her that if she pulled the trigger, every single person in the hall would die. As Zikora gasped in confusion, Kelechi nodded toward his cold-faced enforcer Blade, who quietly looked down. "There is an active explosive planted in this building," Kelechi revealed. Instant panic gripped the congregation, and Zikora stared at him, realizing he was an absolute monster. "You are the most evil person I have ever known," she whispered. Not a single muscle moved on Kelechi's face, though a dark shadow briefly passed through his eyes. Victor kept yelling for Zikora to refuse, while others begged her to save them from a fiery death. Looking around, she saw the terrified faces of her mother, her father, Victor, and innocent guests caught in this madness. Realizing she had no choice, her hand slowly went limp, and the weapon fell to the floor. Tears streamed down her face as she faced the altar again. When the priest asked for her consent, her response was a broken, barely audible whisper. "Yes, I do." Saying those words destroyed her soul entirely. The priest, his own hands shaking, hastily pronounced them husband and wife in a dead silent room. Kelechi slowly turned to his new bride. "I love you," Kelechi whispered as they stood together, but Zecora instantly rejected his hollow words. "No, you do not love me," she hissed. "This is nothing but sick possession." Kelechi frowned, genuinely unable to comprehend the difference between the two concepts, which made Zecora realize just how psychologically damaged he truly was. Later that evening, she walked into the massive Obiora estate, officially his wife. Patricia and Susan met them at the grand entrance, wearing stunning traditional attire and wearing fake sugary smiles. Though they said all the right words of welcome, Zecora saw the burning resentment in their eyes and stayed silent. Once they were alone, Susan burst into Patricia's quarters, raging about how a common girl had just stolen their family fortune. Staring calmly at her own reflection in the vanity mirror, Patricia urged her sister to practice patience. Susan scoffed at the word, but Patricia pointed out that having Zecora under their own roof made plotting her downfall much simpler. A wicked, scheming grin slowly spread across Susan's face as she realized the truth in her sister's words. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Zecora stood silently by the window, refusing to take off her heavy bridal gown. Kelechi walked in, carrying an exquisite black velvet jewelry box he had acquired at a high-end auction. He flipped it open to reveal a magnificent diamond necklace that sparkled under the chandelier, claiming it was perfect for her. "Do you still believe money cannot buy everything?" he asked. "No," Zecora replied coldly, prompting Kelechi to demand why she kept fighting his immense wealth. He explained that while he knew how to buy objects, he was still trying to learn how to give her what she truly desired. When he leaned in for an intimate kiss, she recoiled in disgust. Kelechi's jaw clenched, but he showed rare restraint and kept his distance. In the heavy silence that followed, Zecora felt a chaotic mix of anger and terror. Suddenly stepping forward to plant a fast, defiant kiss on his lips. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim some power in a life where all her choices had been stolen. Surprisingly, Kelechi was the one who pulled back, leaving her completely stunned. "I want you," he murmured, "but not like this." Searching his face for any sign of genuine humanity, Zecora watched as Kelechi turned his eyes away in shame. He claimed he had no desire to force himself on her, but she instantly reminded him of the bitter truth he had already forced her into this entire marriage. The heavy words hung in the air, leaving the powerful billionaire completely speechless. Finally, he insisted that one day she would come to his bed of her own free will. Zecora simply turned her back, telling him to keep waiting forever. The next morning, Patricia and Susan gossiped loudly in the main parlor, completely unaware that Kelechi was listening from the hallway as they ranted about how the disrespectful new bride acted like she owned the entire estate. She has barely spent 24 hours in this house, yet he is already showering her with priceless diamonds. Susan grumbled, warning that the girl would eventually take everything. Kelechi stepped into the room, causing both women to freeze in fear. He made it clear that Zecora was his wife and had a right to everything he owned. When Patricia argued that he was going too far with family assets, Kelechi sharply reminded her that the wealth was his alone to manage. Staring down a trembling Susan, he demanded she apologize to his new bride immediately. Susan gasped, asking what she had done wrong. "For disrespecting her before she even crossed my threshold," Kelechi barked, his voice turning ice-cold as he commanded, "Now." Finding herself completely cornered, Susan marched out to the serene garden where Zecora sat in quiet contemplation. "I am sorry," Susan muttered through clenched teeth, though her eyes flashed with malice. Zecora calmly looked up, asking what exactly she was apologizing for. Susan's expression hardened as she choked out, "For disrespecting you." After studying the bitter woman for a moment, Zecora calmly accepted the empty gesture. Susan spun on her heel and hurried away to hide her boiling rage, her jealousy twisting into a dangerous obsession. Although Zecora had entered this grand estate as a captive, Kelechi was already elevating her above everyone else, threatening Susan's own security and status within the family. Watching Susan leave, Zecora knew very well that the forced apology meant absolutely nothing. You and I can see the heavy tension in this beautiful mansion, a place entirely devoid of peace. Each luxurious hallway felt haunted by listening ears. Every smile seemed to mask a sinister motive, and every gesture of kindness felt like a trap waiting to spring. Later that evening, she remained in the gardens long after the sun had set. Hearing footsteps approach, she instantly recognized Kelechi's stride. He softly suggested that she did not have to remain isolated, but she told him she preferred her own company. To her surprise, he stood quietly beside her, instead of forcing himself onto the bench. "I am slowly beginning to realize a few truths," Kelechi murmured, breaking the silence. Zecora scoffed, asking if he had finally realized that abducting innocent women was a crime. Though his jaw clenched, he absorbed her sharp words and admitted that terror would never build a foundation for love. Zecora laughed bitterly, amazed he was only learning this basic human truth now. He pleaded with her to teach him, explaining that he knew how to run business empires, but knew nothing about tender emotions. "Teach me how to be gentle," he whispered. Looking at the powerful Kelechi Obiora standing vulnerable before her, Zecora felt a sudden wave of confusion, though she quickly warned him that gentleness was not a game. "I am not trying to win a game here, Zecora," Kelechi insisted softly, though she remained deeply skeptical of his motives. She pointed out that victory was always his ultimate goal, but he confessed he was simply exhausted of her looking at him like a heartless beast. Her expression softened for a fleeting second, before she put her guard back up and told him to stop behaving like one. Surprisingly, he promised to try offering no defense before walking away. By the following week, Zecora found herself back at the medical facility. Though she had resigned, Kelechi had pulled strings with the chief medical director to reinstate her and build a brand new wing in her honor, leaving the local nurses completely awestruck. "Your new husband is incredibly generous to donate an entire medical wing in your honor," the nurses exclaimed, whispering envious compliments about how blessed she was. Zecora offered a tight, polite smile, though she felt more suffocated than ever. While her colleagues saw a pampered wife draped in expensive diamonds and married to a powerful tycoon, they were completely blind to the dark reality. They did not know about the hidden gun, the explosive threats, or her father's deep humiliation. One of the nurses, Amaka, nudged her playfully and joked that she must share the secret to trapping such a wealthy man. The laughter of the women only made Zecora's chest tighten, with a desperate urge to scream the truth. The tragic truth was that Zecora had not captured anyone. She was the one who was completely trapped. Later that afternoon, while walking near the quiet rear exit of the clinic, she caught sight of Victor standing near the metal gates. Her breath caught in her throat as she rushed over, demanding to know why he was risking his safety by coming there. He looked noticeably thinner and exhausted, admitting he simply could not bring himself to let her go. Zecora frantically begged him to leave before Kelechi's watchful eyes noticed his presence. Victor stepped closer, begging her to tell him she was safe and happy, but she could only stare in silence as his gaze drifted to her expensive clothes and the armed guards. "I can see the misery in your eyes," Victor whispered, but Zecora desperately urged him to stop speaking. He begged her to escape with him, arguing that they could still flee the city together and build a life. Zecora shook her head, stating she was a married woman now, even if she had been coerced into the union. Victor stared at her in disbelief, reminding her of how Kelechi had destroyed their wedding and treated her like a piece of property. Zecora admitted she knew everything, but warned him that Kelechi would destroy him if he kept showing up. When Victor claimed he was not afraid of the billionaire, she grabbed his hand, urging him to run. Victor looked at their hands, asking if she still loved him. If you and I were to look closely at Zecora in that moment, we would see her desperately wishing she could offer him a simple way out. She longed to say yes, to erase the pain, and return to a time when life made sense. But their reality in Enugu had become far too tangled. "Please, Victor, stop searching for me," she pleaded, her voice trembling. His eyes flooded with tears as he accused her of choosing his rival, unaware she was only trying to protect his life. Watching from a parked car, Susan smiled maliciously. By evening, she marched into Kelechi's private study, placing her phone on his mahogany desk to show the secret photo of them by the hospital side gate. As Kelechi stared at the glowing screen, his entire face hardened into a mask of stone. Susan sneered, whispering that his wife was enjoying his wealth while secretly meeting her former lover. Though he remained motionless, her poison was working. She claimed Zecora was only playing a game of pretend. When Kelechi slowly picked up the phone, his eyes locked onto their clasped hands. Instantly, a monstrous wave of jealousy erupted in his chest, hot and suffocating. "Get out," he commanded, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Susan tried to claim she was only protecting him, but one look at his furious eyes sent her scurrying out, utterly thrilled with the chaos she had unleashed. The destructive spark had been lit, and it did not take long for Kelechi to track Victor down that very night. Inside his dimly lit art studio, Victor stood before an unfinished portrait of Zecora, her painted face still missing its final details. Suddenly, the door flew open, and Victor spun around to find Kelechi stepping inside, flanked by Blade and two heavy men. "Get out of here," Victor demanded, his body tensing as Kelechi scanned the modest room, filled with worn brushes and canvases. Kelechi took in the humble space before whispering, "You saw my wife today?" Victor felt a brief flash of terror, but his pride quickly took over, shouting that Zecora belonged to him first before the forced marriage. A bitter laugh escaped Victor's lips as he taunted the powerful man standing before him. "You can buy a lavish wedding and force people to cheer, but you can never force her heart," he sneered. Enraged, Kelechi lunged forward with terrifying speed, slamming Victor hard against the cold concrete wall. "Do not speak as if you know her better than I do," Kelechi growled. Victor met his gaze defiantly and whispered, "I do." A heavy silence fell over the room before Kelechi slowly stepped back, his eyes chillingly calm. "Which hands did you use to touch her?" he asked. Before Victor could process the question, Kelechi turned to Blade and ordered him to break them, leaving Blade visibly hesitating. With a final cold command, Kelechi sealed the young artist's fate. Victor's eyes went wide with pure terror as the heavy henchman pinned him down. He thrashed and screamed Zecora's name into the empty night, but no one came to save him. Kelechi turned his back, yet the agonizing, bone-snapping shriek still echoed in his ears, sparking a brief flicker of guilt that was quickly buried by his toxic pride. The next morning, the horrific truth exploded into Zecora's world. Victor's hysterical mother cornered her at the hospital, clawing at her arm. "Look at what your husband did to my son's hands," she wailed as Zecora's blood ran cold. "The hands he used to paint are ruined forever." Gasps of disbelief escaped Zecora as the weight of the tragedy crushed her chest. Fleeing the hospital, she raced back to the grand mansion, her mind spinning with horror. She marched straight into the sitting room where Kelechi stood, demanding to know if he truly broke Victor's hands. "He touched you," Kelechi replied coldly, showing no remorse. When Zecora slapped him across the face, the entire house fell dead silent, the servants freezing in shock. Up on the staircase, Susan watched with a twisted grin. Tears spilled down Zikora's cheeks as she stared at the man she once thought could change. "You are a monster," she whispered, devastated that his jealousy had ruined a human life. Her voice shook with rage as she demanded to know how proximity alone justified destroying a man's future. Kelechi's stubborn silence only fueled her anger, proving to her that he did not love her at all and that he merely wanted to possess her like a trophy. She walked out, leaving him alone with his heavy thoughts. From that day on, Zikora refused to touch a single plate of food. 2 days slipped by as the concerned maids carried full trays in and out of her quiet room, the water beside her bed growing warm and stagnant. On the 3rd day of her silent strike, Kelechi finally entered her room, finding her sitting pale and weak by the window, her spirit unbroken. Hovering in the doorway, Kelechi watched her frail figure with a mixture of worry and frustration. He pleaded with her to eat, offering to let her shout or strike him again if it would make her feel better. But Zikora slowly turned to look at him, her eyes cold. "If my starvation causes you even a fraction of pain, then I will gladly continue," she whispered. When he desperately asked what she wanted, her answer was simple: apologize to Victor. Kelechi recoiled at the suggestion of bowing to a poor artist, but Zikora stood her ground, demanding he apologize to the man whose entire future he had ruthlessly shattered, leaving him to battle his immense pride. Her challenging words echoed relentlessly in his mind, driving Kelechi to make an unexpected move the following morning. He walked into Victor's studio, where the artist sat with both hands heavily bandaged, his mother Grace guarding him like a shield. She demanded to know if he had returned to kill her son, but Kelechi ignored her, stating he was there to offer compensation. Blade set a heavy bag on the table, unzipping it to reveal stacks of cash. Victor stared at the 100 million naira and let out a hollow, mocking laugh, reminding the billionaire that paper currency could never piece together a shattered dream. Silence filled the tense room as Kelechi stood face to face with the devastating reality of his actions. Victor wept openly, explaining that his hands were his entire livelihood, stolen simply because of a rich man's jealousy. Swallowing his massive ego, Kelechi forced out the words, "I am sorry." While Grace gasped in utter shock, Victor's laughter turned venomous, mocking the great Kelechi Obiora's sudden humility. "Will your apology restore my nerves or bring Zikora back to me?" Victor spat. As Kelechi remained frozen in discomfort, the broken artist leaned back in despair and begged him to finish the job and kill him, since his life was already over. A subtle shift passed over Kelechi's features as he flatly refused to take Victor's life. Now you and I might expect a ruthless tyrant to show no mercy, but Kelechi was starting to feel the heavy weight of his sins. He admitted that some things could never be repaired, leaving Victor with a dark, festering hatred that now targeted both Kelechi and Zikora. Days later, Inspector Daniel summoned Kelechi to the Okori family compound for a private talk. Looking tired but sharp-eyed, the older investigator stared at the young billionaire and challenged his claims of love, insisting that his obsession was not true affection, insisting that there was a vast gulf between desire and devotion. Daniel explained that real love never demands total control. Kelechi quietly admitted he was trying, but the old detective warned that effort meant nothing while holding a weapon behind his back. For the first time, Kelechi offered no defense, as Daniel reminded him that Zikora was not a trophy won through raw power. She had saved his life, treating his wounds out of pure mercy. "No, she rescued me in ways you cannot imagine," Kelechi confessed, describing a dark lifetime filled with blood and betrayal, where people only stayed out of fear until she found him. To her, he was just a wounded stranger, a human being in desperate need of aid rather than a ruthless mob boss. Hearing this, Daniel felt his anger soften into a reluctant understanding, though he could not offer forgiveness. He advised Kelechi that peace cannot be stolen, and true love must be given freely. "If you truly love my daughter, you must give her the space to choose her own path," Daniel said. The promise cost Kelechi every ounce of his pride, but after a tense silence he nodded, agreeing to let her go if she never loved him. Neither of them knew Zipporah was listening from the doorway. With a conflicted heart, Zipporah lingered in the shadows, grappling with the vulnerability she had just witnessed. While she was far from forgiving his terrible crimes, she found herself wondering if a damaged soul was hidden beneath his violent exterior. The realization that he was not entirely empty terrified her. Later that night, Kelechi sneaked back into the house, carrying a fresh injury, but Zipporah instantly noticed the dark stain of blood soaking through his sleeve. When she demanded to know what happened, he dismissed it as nothing, prompting her to scold him and his stubborn male pride. Reaching for the medical box, Zipporah firmly ordered him to sit down so she could tend to his arm. As we watch them in this quiet room, we can see the cold walls between them slowly beginning to crack. In the hush of the night, she cleaned the painful gash, prompting Kelechi to murmur that Pablo's men were responsible. When she questioned how she knew the name, she admitted she paid more attention than he assumed. She pressed the cotton pad a bit too hard, making him wince. He teased that while Pablo shot him, she was the one who ran him over, though she insisted she only nearly hit him. For a fleeting second, a genuine smile touched her lips. If we look closely at their lives, we can see the exact moment everything started to shift. Kelechi saw the change in her eyes, but he kept quiet, terrified that a single wrong word might shatter this fragile peace. From that night on, a slow transformation began in the Lagos estate. He no longer barged into her room, choosing to knock gently instead. He actually asked if she wanted to eat, rather than commanding the housegirls to force food down her throat. When she wanted to visit her parents, he let Blade drive her, warning him to stay outside the compound. He kept his distance, waiting quietly while she sat in the yard. One evening, Zipporah walked into the dimly lit parlor and found him holding a glass of whiskey, completely still. A sensible voice in her head told her to run back upstairs, but Zipporah found herself sitting on the far edge of the plush sofa instead. Kelechi observed her silently, the heavy atmosphere thick with unspoken words. Eventually, he broke the silence, asking in a low voice if she missed her old life. When she admitted she missed it every single day, he nodded in heavy agreement, confessing that he had taken far too much from her. Her heart fluttered with surprise at his raw honesty as she confirmed his guilt. He admitted his helplessness in undoing the past, to which she gently advised that while the past was set, he could at least stop causing fresh wounds. He just sat there, keeping his distance, simply sharing the quiet space. Surpassing all the expensive gold jewelry and Italian lace he had ever bought her, that simple, quiet moment in the parlor touched Zipporah's soul. Trust was still far out of reach, and she could never forget the pain he had inflicted, but she no longer viewed him as a merciless beast. This subtle shift did not escape the watchful eyes of Patricia and Susan. They noticed how Kelechi's harsh eyes softened whenever Zipporah walked in, and how he actually consulted her before making any moves. Terrified that Zipporah might win his heart entirely and ruin their standing in the family, Susan declared they had to stop her. Sneaking into the bedroom with the help of a compromised housegirl, Susan secretly swapped Zipporah's recovery medicine for birth control pills. Calling Victor was Susan's next calculating move to bring the whole fragile house of cards crashing down. Initially, the bitter young man refused to talk, demands dripping from his lips. But Susan lured him back with the lie that Zipporah still loved him. Victor fell completely silent. Susan painted a picture of Zipporah being held captive by Kelechi, urging him to come rescue her. Though his broken hands had healed terribly after the assault, his shattered ego and broken heart hurt much worse. Desperate to believe she was still his, he crept through the open side gate Susan had left unlocked. Finding Zipporah in the compound, he startled her completely. When he urged her to flee with him, She could only stare in utter disbelief.
Panic gripped Zakura as she urged Victor to leave, warning him that his presence was incredibly dangerous. Victor pleaded with her, professing his undying love, despite having lost his livelihood and his pride. While she expressed deep sorrow for the tragedy he had suffered, she firmly refused his invitation to run away. When he demanded to know if her refusal was because of Kletchi, she turned her face away in shame. He accused her of falling for the monster, prompting her to admit that her feelings had grown complicated. With a heavy sigh, she confessed that something inside her had indeed shifted. Hearing this, Victor felt the final piece of his shattered soul disintegrate, horrified that she could love his tormentor. Struggling to find the right words, Sakura tried to defend herself, but Victor cut her off, claiming that her actions spoke louder than any excuses. Before she could plead her case, Susan marched into the compound alongside Patricia and Kletchi. Kletchi's face instantly transformed into a mask of cold rage upon seeing his rival. Susan smugly held up a small plastic bottle, calling out to her brother to look at what his precious wife had been hiding. She revealed them to be birth control pills, spinning a wicked lie that Zakura was secretly planning an escape with her old lover. Zakura gasped in horror, screaming that it was a setup, but as Kletchi looked at her, his eyes burned with deep betrayal and sorrow. Alternating his gaze between Victor and his trembling wife, Kletchi desperately searched for a reason to believe her cries of innocence. But Victor ruined the moment, shouting bitterly that Zakura did not belong to a tyrant who had already ruined his hands, his career, and his future. Victor dared Kletchi to end his life, causing Kletchi to march forward with murderous intent. Zakura leaped between them, throwing her hands up to halt the collision. When Kletchi snarled at her to move, accusing her of shielding her old flame, she fiercely replied that she was actually shielding him from losing his humanity. Behind her, Victor continued to bait the monster, screaming that blood and violence were all Kletchi knew. Fury consumed Kletchi, as he realized this pathetic rival had dared to enter his private sanctuary once again. Victor, completely unhinged, now spat venomous words at Sakura, telling her she should have stayed far away if she was going to choose his enemy in the end. The sheer cruelty of his words cut her deeply, but they also pushed Kletchi over the edge. Snatching a pistol from his bodyguard's holster, he aimed it directly at Victor's chest. Zakura screamed in terror, begging him to lower the weapon, while Victor dared him to pull the trigger. As Kletchi's hand trembled with rage, Zakura looked into his eyes, whispering that she wasn't begging for Victor's life, but to save Kletchi's own soul. Standing off to the side, Susan watched the standoff with quiet irritation, thoroughly disappointed that a bullet had not already been fired. Beside her, Patricia kept her expression perfectly blank, refusing to betray her thoughts. Following an agonizing silence where the entire compound held its collective breath, Kletchi slowly lowered the heavy weapon. He barked an order to throw Victor out, and Blade instantly grabbed the broken man. Victor offered no resistance, only staring at Zakura with eyes that had curdled from love into pure malice. He muttered a bitter warning that she would regret her betrayal before Blade dragged him out. Kletchi turned to his wife, torn between his deep love and the damning evidence. We all know how fragile trust can be, and for these two, the cracking of their peace was almost deafening. Kletchi confessed he was trying to believe her, but trying was a far cry from actual trust. Standing frozen between Kletchi's deep torment and Susan's wicked scheme, Zakura realized their brand new foundation was crumbling to pieces. Later that night, she wept silently in the compound while he stood a few paces away, obsessively turning the pill bottle over in his hands. When she softly told him that his inability to trust her made all his promises of change completely worthless, he remained dead silent. That heavy, suffocating silence cut her deeper than any harsh words could have, prompting her
to walk away. Long after she had gone inside, Kelechi stood alone in the dark compound, swallowed by a rare and frustrating sense of helplessness. He possessed limitless wealth, dangerous men, and absolute power, yet none of it could erase the deep disappointment he had seen in Zakura's eyes. Retreating to his private office, he locked himself away, only to be interrupted later by a beautifully dressed Susan. She had styled her hair perfectly and doused herself in a heavy perfume that preceded her arrival. Beneath her soft expression lurked a desperate hunger for his attention. When he coldly demanded to know what she wanted, she claimed she was only checking on him, swallowing her anger when he snapped that he hadn't asked her to. With a voice dripping with mock concern, Susan questioned why Kelechi was torturing himself over a woman like Zakura, who had never truly wanted him. He flatly ordered her to leave, but she refused to budge, desperately claiming that Zakura was just using him and remained devoted to Victor. When Kelechi demanded her exit a second time, she boldly confessed her own desires, causing him to freeze in absolute shock. She stepped closer, admitting she had craved his attention ever since her mother married his father. Pointing out that they shared no actual blood, she begged him to choose her instead. Kelechi could only stare at her, his face twisted in deep, unadulterated disgust as she began to weep. Eager to prove her worth, Susan argued that she alone could bear him proper heirs and preserve the legendary Obiora family dynasty. She claimed she understood the heavy demands of wealth and power, warning him that Zakura would only make him look weak. Kelechi recoiled in disgust, ordering her never to utter such garbage again. When she whimpered his name, he delivered a crushing blow, stating that Zakura possessed everything Susan lacked: a genuine heart, real courage, and an honesty that remained unbroken even when it opposed him. Branding Susan as nothing but an envious, greedy parasite, he pointed fiercely toward the exit. Humiliation washed over her before she retreated. Walking down the long, opulent corridor, Susan's tears of shame rapidly transformed into a burning, venomous rage. She could feel her grip on the immense Obiora fortune and prestige slipping right through her fingers. Having grown up believing the massive Ikoyi estate and respect were her birthright, she could not stomach a simple nurse stealing Kelechi's heart. But even as she plotted her next deception, loyal forces were already moving against her. Blade, Kelechi's chief head of security, had never swallowed her convenient story. He knew the unlocked gate, the suddenly discovered pills, and Pablo's recent movements were too neat to be a coincidence. Acting on his gut, Blade began to investigate in secret. Under intense interrogation, the house staff quickly began to sing, and the ugly truth started unraveling strand by strand. A driver confessed to driving Susan to secret meetings with Pablo's criminal associates, while call logs proved she had lured Victor to the estate. Soon after, another contact admitted that Patricia had paid a massive bribe to cover up the initial car crash and buy Pablo's silence. When Blade finally laid out the evidence in Kelechi's private office, the silence in the room was suffocating. Kelechi sat completely motionless behind his desk, his expression deadly calm as he processed the betrayal. Blade gently slid the file forward, revealing how Susan and Patricia had orchestrated it all. A familiar, dangerous chill settled over Kelechi's features, a look that Blade recognized instantly as a warning of the storm to come. Coldly, Kelechi gave the order to bring them in, and before midnight, Patricia and Susan were marched into the dim study. At first, Susan tried to wear a mask of innocence, crying out that whatever he had been told was nothing but lies. But the illusion shattered when Kelechi slammed a thick folder onto the table. As Susan stared at the damning photographs, the phone records, and the statements, her face crumbled. Beside her, Patricia sat rigid, clinging to her pride. Kelechi looked down at them, accusing them of trying to murder his wife. Desperate, Patricia pleaded that they only wanted to protect the family legacy by getting rid of Zakura. Then Kelechi stood up.
Kelechi's voice was a low, lethal purr as he listed their sins, accusing them of tampering with her medication, bringing Victor into their lives, and conspiring with Pablo. They had almost shattered his marriage and put his wife in grave danger. Hearing this, Patricia's proud facade finally cracked, and she wept, begging for mercy for what she called a mistake. But Kelechi looked at her with total detachment, saying, "A mistake is when a glass is broken, whereas this was a cold, calculated plan." Susan fell to her knees, crying out to her brother, but he snapped that he was not her brother. Turning to Blade, Kelechi ordered him to record their full confessions. Even as they screamed that this would ruin them, Kelechi noted they had ruined themselves. Yet, as they were dragged away, he felt no peace. The painful reality of his own foolishness finally became clear to Kelechi as he realized Zecora had never betrayed him. You and I can only imagine the heavy guilt weighing on his chest as he prepared to face her, knowing his own fear and jealousy had blinded him to her loyalty. But before he could seek her forgiveness, another sudden tragedy struck Lagos. Inspector Daniel was found brutally beaten near his home and rushed to the hospital. When Zecora arrived and saw her father lying helpless in the ICU, her world shattered once more. His face was terribly swollen, his breathing shallow, while her mother sat weeping beside the bed. As the old inspector struggled to open his eyes, Zecora's heart twisted with agonizing grief. Then, out of nowhere, Patricia and Susan appeared at the hospital ward. Rushing into the sterile hospital room, Susan put on a dramatic display of horror, loudly gasping as she asked what had happened. Zecora was far too exhausted and emotionally drained to even offer a reply. Standing nearby, Patricia pressed a hand to her chest, whispering how absolutely terrible the situation was. Then Susan leaned in close, her eyes filled with a calculated, sickening pity, as she whispered that Zecora already knew who was behind this attack. As Zecora turned to look at her, Susan hissed a single name: Kelechi, causing a wave of icy terror to wash over the young woman. Patricia quickly chimed in, reminding her of Kelechi's past threats that her parents would suffer if she ever dared to run. Though Zecora shook her head in denial, the seed of doubt was planted. Whispering a quiet denial did nothing to stop the cold hands of fear from squeezing Zecora's heart. Kelechi's ruthless warning echoed in her mind, reminding her of his promise that her family would pay if she ran. When her father groaned in pain on the hospital bed, her vision blurred with tears of pure rage. She desperately wanted to believe Kelechi was innocent, but she could not forget the monster who had forced her into marriage and shattered Victor's hands. Driven by blinding anger, she left the clinic and drove to the Obiora mansion, carrying her father's spare handgun, which she had secretly taken from his drawer earlier. Storming into Kelechi's private study, she caught him completely off guard, and he stood up instantly, uttering her name in shock. With trembling hands, Zecora raised the heavy pistol and aimed it directly at Kelechi's chest. Kelechi froze instantly, his eyes locked on her. When Blade stepped forward to disarm her, Kelechi raised a hand, commanding his loyal guard to leave the room. Blade hesitated for a second before slowly backing out, closing the door behind him. Zecora's hands shook violently as she screamed, asking how he could have brutally attacked her father after taking everything else from her. Kelechi swore he had not touched him, but she refused to believe his lies, pointing out his past threats. As he tried to step closer to calm her down, she yelled for him to stay back, weeping as she declared that her father was clinging to life in a hospital bed because of him. Desperation cracked Kelechi's voice as he swore on his life that he was innocent, explaining that his men had been investigating the assault since the moment he heard. Zecora bitterly asked why she should ever believe a word from his mouth after everything he had done. Kelechi's face tightened with pain, but before he could answer, Blade burst into the study, panting heavily. Kelechi snapped at him to leave, but Blade insisted they had uncovered crucial evidence.
Zecora kept her weapon raised, as Blade revealed that the weapon used to beat Inspector Daniel carried fingerprints belonging to Victor Deem. Shocked, Zecora gasped in denial. But Blade added that phone records placed Victor near the hospital right before the attack. Swaying slightly, Zecora took a step backward as the ground seemed to tilt violently beneath her feet. She fiercely insisted that Victor would never do such a thing, accusing Kelechi of framing him. But before anyone could argue, Victor himself walked in, flanked by 2 police officers. He looked frail, his hands still wrapped in bandages from his previous injuries. He immediately claimed that he knew Kelechi would try to frame him for this tragedy. Zecora begged Victor to tell her he had not touched her father, and Victor looked at her with deeply wounded eyes, asking how she could even question him. As Kelechi's jaw clenched, Victor pointed a finger at him, declaring Kelechi was the one with the power and the men to do this. Victor continued his desperate assault, reminding her that Kelechi had threatened her family from the very start. Zecora looked between the 2 men, her heart tearing completely in 2. Just then, her phone rang, showing her mother's name on the screen. Answering quickly, she heard her mother weep with joy, explaining that her father was finally awake and asking for her. Within minutes, everyone rushed to the Lagos hospital room. Inspector Daniel was incredibly weak, but his eyes were clear as Zecora knelt tearfully by his side, begging to know who had done this to him. The old man's gaze wandered slowly across the room before stopping directly on Victor. As Victor's expression twisted in panic, Daniel raised a trembling hand, pointed at him, and whispered his name. Struggling to draw enough breath to speak, Daniel weakly explained that Victor had come to him, venting his rage. He had ranted that Kelechi took everything from him, and that Zecora belongs to him alone. Hearing this, Victor's innocent mask began to crack. Zecora whispered his name, staring at him as the gentle man she once loved seemed to vanish, swallowed entirely by a dark, consuming bitterness. Victor suddenly nodded, admitting to the crime. A heavy silence fell over the room as he let out a soft, broken laugh. When Zecora desperately cried out, asking him why, Victor's eyes welled with tears of deep hatred. He screamed that Kelechi had stripped him of everything he ever cared about, taking away Zecora, his grand dreams, and his hands. Victor spat out that Kelechi had stolen his entire future, his voice dripping with pure venom. Zecora wept, protesting that her father had done nothing to deserve this violence, but Victor snapped back, asking what he had done to deserve broken hands and pity when all he did was love her. Zecora told him that while he was hurt, he had still chosen a path of dark revenge that destroyed his own life. As Victor's eyes burned with malice, Blade walked into the room, alongside 2 police officers holding a set of legal files. Blade gently informed Zecora that they had reopened the case of her late brother, John. Zecora's breath caught, as Blade revealed that John's death was never actually connected to Kelechi's gang. The original police report had been deliberately doctored to hide the truth, a revelation that turned Victor's face completely pale. Zecora looked at him in total confusion, whispering, asking what they were talking about. Blade handed the heavy file to one of the officers, who explained that years ago, an argument broke out between John Akori and Victor Deem. John had discovered that Victor was actively helping Pablo's syndicate move illegal funds through art sales and fake exhibitions. When John threatened to expose him, Victor panicked and shot him dead. Pablo's men then helped Victor cover it up, making it look like a rival gang hit. Seeing his late son's killer finally revealed, Inspector Daniel looked utterly destroyed. Inspector Daniel rasped out his profound betrayal, whispering that he had trusted Victor and had been ready to give him his daughter. Victor's eyes darted frantically around the hospital room as his innocence vanished completely. Zecora stared at him, her heart broken into pieces, whispering that he had killed her brother. Victor sneered that John should have minded his own business. Nearly collapsing, Zecora shrank away from the man she had loved, defended, and almost married, realizing he was the true monster hiding in the shadows all along.
Victor began to shout, claiming John had looked down on him and threatened to expose him, crying out that everyone had always judged him and made him feel incredibly small. Zikora's tears fell silently. Zikora's voice trembled with agonizing disbelief as she accused him of murder and letting her family suffer under a false blame for years. Victor snapped back, asking if she knew how humiliating it was to feel worthless next to powerful men like Kelechi, who possessed wealth, power, and even her. Zikora wept, saying he had possessed their absolute trust and love. Victor let out a bitter laugh, declaring that trust could never buy greatness. As the police officers closed in, Victor drew a small blade from his sleeve and grabbed one officer, plunging the room into absolute chaos. While people screamed, Kelechi immediately threw himself in front of Zikora and her father, acting out of pure protective love. With a wild look in his eyes, Victor screamed that since his own life was ruined, he would ensure theirs was destroyed as well. Zikora begged him to stop pointing out that his own choices, lies, and revenge had brought him to this point of madness. If you and I had been in that room, the sheer velocity of the tragedy would have taken our breath away. More officers rushed in, successfully disarming Victor. But during the violent scuffle, one officer's firearm slipped onto the floor. Victor spotted the gun, snatched it up, and aimed it directly at Zikora's chest. Kelechi lunged forward to shield her, and a deafening shot echoed through the room. As Zikora screamed, Kelechi stood rigid before blood began to bloom across his shirt. Kelechi collapsed heavily to the floor as the entire hospital ward dissolved into sheer pandemonium. Officers tackled Victor to the ground, arresting him and dragging him away, though his angry shouts were muffled to Zikora's ears. She fell to her knees beside Kelechi, sobbing and pressing her hands over his chest, his warm blood staining her fingers, just as it had on the day they first met on that lonely road. But this time, she knew his name, and the terror gripping her soul was no longer born of mere obligation. Looking up at her weakly, Kelechi whispered that she was finally safe. She begged him to remain quiet, but he weakly murmured his old words, telling her to leave him. Realizing her true feelings, Zikora wept, begging him to live. If you and I had been standing in that sterile Lagos hospital corridor, we would have felt the dread paralyzing Zikora as she watched Kelechi bleed. Despite the pain and their dark, forced beginning, a deep affection had taken root in her heart. Surgeons rushed him into theater while she waited in agony. Beside her, Mrs. Rose offered a grounding grip while a battered Inspector Daniel rolled up in a wheelchair filled with silent sorrow. Hours drifted by. When the doctor finally emerged to confirm that the billionaire would survive, Zikora wept in quiet, shuddering relief, her body releasing a burden too heavy to carry. For days she remained by his bedside, and when he finally opened his eyes, she was right there. Staring up at her from the hospital bed, Kelechi whispered, asking why she had stayed when he was the reason she got shot. Zikora quietly corrected him, saying she was shot simply because Victor chose to pull the trigger. She cast her gaze down, avoiding his weary eyes. Her silence was not from a lack of hearing, but from the realization that a simple apology could never bridge the chasm of their shared trauma. Once his strength returned enough to sit up, she made her desires clear. She wanted to leave the estate in Lekki. Kelechi studied her, his mind reeling. The tyrant he used to be would have bolted the doors, ordered the guards to block the gates, and called that violent control love. Instead of anger, this broken version of Kelechi merely offered a slow, defeated nod. He quietly reminded her of the promise he made to her father. If she wished to depart, he would not stand in her way. Zikora searched his expression, scanning for the shadow of a clever trap, but his eyes held only genuine grief. He admitted he had zero right to beg for her affection after the pain he had inflicted. Although her heart softened, she kept her distance,
explaining her desperate need to breathe and rediscover her identity free from terror. He agreed without protest. Thus, Zecora walked out of the high walls of the Obiora estate. No trailing security detail followed her, no tinted sedans lingered, and no shadow of a threat hung over her family. Seeking refuge from the storm, Zecora returned to her family home in the suburbs of Enugu. The familiar rooms felt remarkably quiet now, holding a bittersweet mixture of mourning, hard truth, and gradual healing. Her father, Inspector Daniel, was plagued by agonizing remorse for his misplaced trust in Victor, knowing he had nearly delivered his daughter to the monster who murdered John. He carried this self-loathing until Zecora comforted him one quiet evening, holding his hand and reminding him that they were all blinded by grief. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rose wept bitter tears for their lost son, though the truth brought a sliver of peace. Justice began its work as Victor was hauled off in chains, formally charged with murder, conspiracy, and attempted assassination. During the investigation, local authorities uncovered medical records exposing Victor's elaborate deception regarding his supposedly ruined hands. While one wrist had indeed suffered severe damage from Kelechi's brutal orders, Victor had wildly embellished his injuries. He paid off a corrupt clinic assistant and wore unnecessary wraps simply to manipulate Zecora's kind heart and paint Kelechi as an absolute monster. This revelation cut Zecora to the bone, not because it cleared Kelechi of his sins, but because Victor had twisted her empathy into a cruel tool of manipulation. Rather than pursuing her, Kelechi chose to prove his transformation through quiet deeds, delivering the entire cartel ledger to the federal police and severing ties with the violent thugs who wore his family name. If we look closely at this moment, we see a man dismantling his own empire by declaring that all ties to the old syndicate were permanently severed. Despite the angry protests of his former associates, Kelechi surrendered the highly confidential financial ledgers to state investigators, willingly sacrificing his vast wealth and family reputation. He stripped Patricia and Susan of their authority without hesitation. Patricia was forced to answer to the courts for her complicity in the cover-up, while Susan faced charges for fabricating evidence and aiding Victor's infiltration. As the police led Susan away, she spat that he had betrayed his own blood for a woman. But Kelechi calmly replied that he was merely purging poison. Though critics mocked his reforms as a mere public relations stunt, the business began to shift. Skeptics in the Lagos elite waited for the billionaire to slip back into his ruthless habits, but he never did. Observing from a distance, Zecora caught wind of his reforms, like his firing of corrupt enforcers. She learned he was funding clinics in the Delta anonymously and quietly compensating the families of past victims without any media fanfare. For the first time, Kelechi was not using his wealth to purchase absolution, but was genuinely striving for redemption. As months slipped by, Zecora's recovery proved turbulent. She toggled between intense hatred and a profound ache of longing, haunted by memories of the explosive wedding, yet comforted by the memory of his patient presence. She realized that emotional healing is a winding, unpredictable road. On a quiet Tuesday afternoon, Zecora made the choice to visit Kelechi on her own terms. No security detail escorted her, no threats hung over her head, and no underlying fear dictated her movements. Stepping back into the Obiora estate, she immediately noticed a profound shift in the atmosphere. The house felt remarkably subdued, stripped of its old predatory arrogance. Kelechi was resting in the garden when Blade quietly announced her unexpected arrival. He stood up so abruptly that his wrought iron chair nearly tipped over, freezing in place when his eyes met hers. They exchanged quiet compliments about looking healthier, a soft breeze rustling the leaves. He politely gestured toward a seat without issuing any of his old commanding demands, and she chose to sit down simply because she wanted to. For several minutes they simply sat together and listened to the gentle wind whispering through the palm trees. Zecora broke the silence, firmly stating that she could never erase the memories of his past actions. Kelechi quietly acknowledged his guilt, offering a sincere apology. She refused to romanticize their dark history, reminding him of how he had terrified her and dragged her into a world she never wanted. Yet she confessed she could not ignore his genuine transformation. Looking up with a glimmer of hope, Kelechi explained that he had needed to give her total freedom to see who he truly was without coercion. When she admitted she saw a flawed but genuinely trying man, he swallowed hard, confessing he had once mistaken toxic possession for actual love.
In his twisted view of romance, he had believed that providing wealth and keeping her close by force equated to true affection. Hearing this confession, Zikora's gaze softened as he admitted that her defiance rather than submission had opened his eyes. She looked out over the garden, holding back tears, as she declared that affection cannot flourish within a cage, but requires absolute freedom to survive. Kelechi agreed softly. When she rose to her feet, he stood up as well, yet he maintained a respectful distance. This silent restraint moved her far more deeply than any lavish gift ever had. She quietly reminded him that she was not ready to rush back to him, and he gently replied that he had never expected her to. She explained that she was taking her time to make a decision, to which he promised he would patiently wait. Zikora warned him not to underestimate the difficulty, teasing that she might still throw harsh words his way, and he admitted he deserved far worse. A faint, genuine smile played on her lips. Taking a brave step forward, she reached out and gently grasped his hand. It was a choice born of her own free will, entirely free from the shadows of captivity, fear, or material wealth. Kelechi stared down at their entwined fingers, completely choked with emotion. Zikora looked at him with serene clarity, proposing a fresh beginning as equals rather than a wealthy captor and a frightened nurse, but rather as two broken souls building on ruins. As you and I look at them standing in the garden, Kelechi clasped her fingers with a gentle touch, realizing that devotion is not something to be gripped until it bleeds. True affection required tenderness. Their journey did not magically culminate in a flawless, happy ending, as deep emotional scars would still demand time to heal. Painful memories would continue to sting, and apologies would have to be lived out through everyday actions rather than spoken words. Nevertheless, for the absolute first time, the power of choice rested entirely in Zikora's hands. Because she held the reins of her own destiny, hope finally found room to breathe. While brute force had mandated their wedding, only patience and truth could earn a real union.